Hello everyone and welcome back to Mossy Bottom, my 2-hectare homestead here in southwest Finland. It is late July and so far this summer Angela and I have completed the 2-meter high fence, as you can see behind me, around our vegetable plot. We've constructed a dock for our little fishing boat, more on that in a future video, and we've built a new compost area, but not just any old compost area. I've tried to take everything I learned from 7 years of composting waste for self-sufficiency back in Ireland and apply that to the design and function of my composting system here in Finland. And some of you may be thinking, really Daniel, composting? What a boring subject for a video. Bring on the house renovation, the fishing trips and the dream cottages. But let me tell you folks, if I had to pick the most fundamental practice which defines self-sufficiency as a lifestyle, it would be composting. Because taking waste and turning it into food means, if you get it right, that your homestead is not dependent on external inputs like oil-based fertilizer or truckloads of manure in the case of organic systems. Both of which can be expensive to buy and transport and unreliable in terms of availability. I know that from all the farmers, organic and non-organic, that I've lived alongside these past years. Composting is the glue that binds all the different elements of a self-sufficient homestead together. It creates a circular system, and in this video I want to explain how and introduce you to my newly created compost area here in Finland. So here it is, 3 bays, each holding about 7 cubic meters if they were full, constructed from treated timber and built into the side of this slope. And I'll talk about the specifics of this design shortly, but first let's talk about what compost is, and just as important, what it isn't. Many people think of compost as that slimy heap of grass cuttings or stack of branches which they never got round to doing anything with at the bottom of the garden, which never really ends up looking like the bags of black gold which they buy from the garden centre every spring. And there are some pretty fundamental reasons for that, which I suspect many of you already know, especially my growing number of Finnish viewers, because I was delighted to discover that composting is a lot more mainstream here in Finland than it is anywhere else that I've lived, at least. To create compost, you need 4 things. Firstly, nitrogen. That's your grass cuttings, your vegetable waste, fallen apples like the ones I've got in this wheelbarrow, green matter basically. Then you need carbon. That's your straw, cardboard, wood chips, brown matter. Thirdly, you need moisture, usually in the form of rain, that's enough. And finally, number 4, you need oxygen. And that's the part that many people get wrong. Composting is an aerobic process, so all those grass cuttings and vegetable peelings have to have sufficient airflow in order for aerobic bacteria to turn them into soil. That is why John Seymour wrote in his seminal book, The Complete Guide to Self-Sufficiency, that, and I quote, anyone can pile up stuff to make a heap, but only a true countryman can make a good stack with vertical sides. I'm not sure how PC the idea of a true countryman is these days, probably not very, but I love that quote all the same, and it's very true. If you want good compost, don't make a heap, make a stack with vertical sides that allow air to circulate through the compost. The less ventilation, the more frequently you will have to turn that compost. And believe me, on any kind of scale like this, using compost and turning it is back-breaking work, which is best avoided. I may enjoy splitting logs with an axe, and you've probably seen me do that in previous videos, but when it comes to making compost, I'd rather let nature do the work for me. The less back-breaking turning, the better. In Ireland, I used vertical logs with 1 to 2 inch gaps between them for ventilation, and I didn't turn the compost at all. I just left it for that bit longer. My design here in Finland is slightly different, but the principle is the same. The other thing that people can get wrong is the ratio of nitrogen, green, to carbon, brown. There is absolutely a science to this, as there is with most things, but broadly the ratio should be 2 parts carbon, brown, to every 1 part nitrogen, green, and it should be stacked in layers. So you want to avoid having all the green and then all the brown. The carbon layers aid ventilation of the nitrogen layers because they tend to be things like wood chips, lots of that here, or cardboard, which are very full of air gaps, so they allow the air to permeate through. Finally, moisture. Aerobic bacteria needs water to do its job, but too much water and that aerobic bacteria dies. So a compost area should not be situated where land can flood. Nor should it be allowed to dry out entirely either, because that too will kill the very bacteria that do all the hard work for you. In most green climates, like here in Finland and Ireland where I used to live, just allowing rainfall to access the compost is sufficient. And if you do have a heat wave, water it down with your hosepipe. So don't overly cover it, or if you do, use a water permeable cover. One thing I've just noticed today is on the edge of this heap we already have fungi growing, which is a really good sign. There are other variables, of course, but unless you enjoy making compost as an art form, yes, some people do, there's YouTube videos to prove it, don't pay too much attention to anything else. If you can build a ventilated stack rather than heap with layers of carbon and nitrogen at a roughly 2-to-1 ratio in favour of carbon, and leave it to get rained on for a year, then you will almost certainly have some black gold of your own at the end of it. Okay, let's dig a little deeper, both metaphorically and literally, into my compost area. I only finished building this in June this year, so you'll have to imagine how the use of this space will evolve. But why 3 bays? Well, in any given year, 1 bay will be emptying, 1 bay will be filling, and 1 bay will be cooking. And most of the emptying will happen in the spring, and most of the filling will happen in the summer. So 3 bays allows the compost to mature for about 2 years before it's used. And 2 years is an important time scale for reasons I'll go into in a bit. In Ireland, I realised that the hardest thing about compost is loading it up when your stack is already quite full, as the one on the end there already is. Every wheelbarrow load and bucket has to be lifted up to get on top of that pile, which is fine when it's 1 or 2, but when it's hundreds every year on a small holding like this, that becomes back-breaking and energy sapping. So this time around I decided to use the natural elevation change from the track where I'm standing now to the meadow down below to my advantage. I've effectively built this compost area into the edge of the main artery of my land. And that makes it infinitely easier to load. Not only can I tip wheelbarrow loads in from up here where I am now, but I can also back a garden tractor in to drop grass cuttings directly onto the compost. And that is going to make a huge difference to how easy this is to use. What about emptying the compost after 2 years? Well, there's a reason I made these bays quite wide, about 1.5 metres, and not the standard 1 metre, which of course would have been an advantage for ventilation, I do know that. Having that additional width, that ½ metre, means that the bucket from a compact tractor could potentially fit in here and lift the compost up without me having to manually dig it out by hand like I did in Ireland for 7 years. Of course, I don't have a tractor yet, I wish I did, but it is something that I'm now hoping to save for in the future. So if you have a homestead and not just a back garden, design your compost area in such a way that makes it easy to load and unload, because that will save you a huge amount of energy in the long run. If you just have a garden, then the ideal size for a compost bay is probably 1 metre square, or maybe 1 metre wide by 2 metres long, because it just makes ventilation that much easier. In terms of my location, this area is right next to my vegetable plot. You can see that behind me, I think, where the resulting compost from these bays will be used. And it's very central on my land. Not only does it adjoin the main track, which is in front of me behind the camera, and that connects the house and outbuildings to the forest and the orchard, but it's also right in the middle of the area where I'll cut grass. I've come to realise that a good compost area is more a beating heart at the centre of your enterprise than a bulging heap at the edge. Maybe people will quote me on that one day. That would be nice. Saying that, this is also well away from the house, the buildings and our neighbours. It's important to say that because you need to keep pests away. Compost, especially open compost, will attract rodents and other pests, so you want them to be a good distance away from people. Now let's talk about ingredients. What do I add to my compost? What is the perfect recipe for the perfect compost? Well, honestly, if you want to know that, consult a book on soil science, work out the macro and micronutrient requirements of the plants you want to grow, and of course different plants have different requirements. It depends a lot on whether it's a leaf crop or a root crop or a fruit crop. And then ensure that the ingredients you add to your compost provide adequate quantities of each nutrient. Carbon and nitrogen are obvious, but also things like phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, iron, manganese, and so on. There are many. You could do that just like you could analyze and control the nutrient content of every food you eat, and some people do. But it's a lot easier to just eat a varied diet and hope that you've covered all bases. And I think the same principle applies when it comes to making compost. The most important thing, I would argue, in a self-sufficient system is to use what you produce, because if you have to drive somewhere to buy something or even acquire it for free that you are then dependent on every year, like cow or horse manure or coffee grounds, then that system is vulnerable and no longer self-sufficient. I do of course aim to produce what I need, essential in a circular system if you want to connect all those dots. And I made 2 videos back in Ireland about permaculture, which explains that process in much more detail. Probably the videos I'm most proud of on this channel, so do take a look if you haven't already. As it relates to compost though, this is broadly my plan. We heat our house in the winter predominantly, not entirely, but mostly with firewood from our 2 hectares of land, 1 hectare of which is forest. And that means branches are abundant. Now most of those need to remain in the forest to rot, providing habitat for native flora and fauna, things like mushrooms, insects, birds, etc., and to replenish the nutrients in the soil. But some of those branches I can take out and with the aid of a wood chipper turn into well aerated wood chips, and that is my main source of carbon or brown matter. And of course ventilation too. Layers of wood chips allow air to permeate through the compost, which is really important, as we've talked about already. Wait just a minute there, Daniel. You can't use wood chips in compost. They're too acidic. They'll acidify your soil and kill your vegetable plants. Well, it's true that freshly cut wood chips have a pH of between 3 and 6, and most vegetables need a pH of about 6.5, around neutral. But like so many other growers, I've been using wood chips for a long time to make compost, 7 years in my case, and year on year I've had better vegetable crops, so that just isn't borne out by the results. And there are 3 important reasons why. First, the species of tree makes a big difference when it comes to the pH of the resulting wood chips. Broadly speaking, species of coniferous tree like pine and spruce are very acidic on the pH scale, from about 3 to 3.5. Birch, however, which is very abundant here, has a much higher pH of about 5.3, as do most broadleaf species. And that's what I use for making compost. But yes, still not 6.5, which brings me to the second reason. Acidity decreases during the composting process, and the longer you leave it to cook, i.e. for the bacteria to do its job, the less acidic it will become. In fact, even pine needles, which are very acidic when fresh, left out on the soil will lose their high acidity very rapidly as they break down. And there's plenty of studies online which show that for the doubters out there. I'm sure there's a few of you. Thirdly, you can of course add things to your compost which is more alkaline on the pH scale to counteract the acidity of those wood chips. And probably the best, if your home is heated by firewood every winter, as mine is wood ash, which has a very high pH of 10 to 12, so very, very alkaline. Last winter, our first winter here in Finland, we produced, and I of course saved, about 200 litres of wood ash, and you can see some of it in the wheelbarrow behind me. Not only is wood ash great for increasing the pH of compost, making it more alkaline, but it's also rich in many nutrients, which comes back to what I said earlier about giving your compost stack a balanced diet. Wood ash is an excellent source of potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, and other key nutrients. And again, there is a whole science to this, some of which I was lucky enough to study when I went to college, but this is a 20-minute video intended to inspire, I hope. So if you are an aficionado of composting or soil science in general, then please forgive me for keeping it relatively simple. It's not necessarily the case that I'm showing everything I know here. I'm just trying to motivate people perhaps to start composting systems of their own. There are, of course, other things you can add to neutralize high acidity in your compost or soil, like, for instance, agricultural lime, which is used commercially in agriculture, and you can buy that at agri-stores and probably garden centres too. But the need to source that externally goes against my own principle of using what I can produce, so I try not to lime. I used it once in 7 years living on a homestead in Ireland. I think I bought 3 50-kilogram bags, which was enough to raise the pH of my 1-acre plot to a neutral level for several years. It's potent stuff. I also add plenty of this stuff, cardboard, which unfortunately I end up with like everyone else because I have to buy things which are often shipped here with huge amounts of packaging, quite a bit of it I tend to think being unnecessary. These days I celebrate if there's more cardboard in that packaging than there is plastic, because at least I can use the cardboard to feed my plants via my compost system. I leave it out in the rain because wet cardboard is a lot easier to tear up than dry cardboard. I won't be doing it today. And I always make sure that the tape and labels, anything plasticated, is taken off first. Again, let it get wet and that process is many times easier. In terms of carbon, I also add dried leaves, which I have plenty of here in the autumn and I can easily gather. And when I introduce livestock like chickens, which I will hopefully next year, straw will also be something I add for carbon, which I'll have to use for bedding. So what do I produce that provides nitrogen, the green stuff? Well, the obvious one is grass cuttings, and there is always a need to cut grass mechanically, be it with a scythe, not anymore for me, or a lawnmower or brush cutter around paths and borders. You can see behind me an area which perfectly illustrates that. I need a path next to my vegetable area and I need a path inside the vegetable area around the crops. So I have to cut those areas, which produces a lot of grass cuttings. Also around the house, there's an area where our daughter plays. On a 2-hectare plot like this, I think when everything is set up, there'll still be about ½ an acre of grass which I will regularly cut just for it to function properly. And the key with grass cuttings is not to add any weed seeds, because eventually they will start growing. Probably not in your compost because they'll be buried too deep, but quite possibly when you spread it on your soil a year or two later. But doesn't composting kill weed seeds? Well, this is where it's important to distinguish between regular composting, like this, and hot composting. Like this. We have a compost bin here which has insulated sides that traps heat, allowing the bacteria to operate at a much higher temperature. If that temperature exceeds about 60 degrees Celsius, for a month or more, then it will kill most weed seeds. Though bear in mind that the temperatures at the sides are always different to the middle. In my experience, some seeds always survive. We use hot compost for waste from the house, vegetable cuttings and toilet waste, which I will talk about very soon. For the moment though, back to this, which, although the action of bacteria does generate a lot of heat in there, could not be considered hot compost. So with grass and wildflowers and weeds, I cut and add just about everything up to, but not beyond the point that it goes to seed. The stems, leaves and even flowers of nettles, for instance, are full of nutrients and excellent for compost making. Just don't include those seeds. What do you do then if it's already gone to seed? Well, you could cut all the seed heads off and then hot compost them if you want, if you have a hot composting area big enough, or just separate seed compost from regular compost. For creating soil, for instance, that you need to fill holes or level ground where it doesn't really matter if some of those seeds eventually germinate and grow. I mentioned household waste like everyone else. I have vegetable peelings, tea bags, apple cores and other organic matter from the kitchen, which all goes in the hot compost. But I also have a lot of vegetable waste from processing the vegetables that I grow, which you can see behind me. Stalks, roots, leaves, the bits you don't eat to grow a pumpkin, a corn cob, a tomato, a potato. There's an awful lot of organic matter that can be recycled, and predictably, that organic matter contains a lot of the nutrients that the next crop of the very same plants will need to grow again. So recycle it. The final ingredient in my compost is, yes, toilet waste. And I know this is a controversial one, but in my opinion, it really shouldn't be. Yes, human waste can contain pathogens which can be dangerous to people. E. coli, salmonella, and others like that. But you need one of two things to eliminate those pathogens. One, heat, or two, time. The heat of a hot compost bin will kill things like E. coli and salmonella. Just make sure it reaches a hot enough temperature, over 60 degrees Celsius. And most people agree 12 months or more in a regular compost system like the one I showed you here is also enough time to kill those pathogens. If you want to play it safe, as I do, then opt for a 2-year cycle, which comes back to why I have 3 compost bays. When it comes to human waste, ours gets treated for pathogens twice, because we first nuke it in the hot compost, the aero bin, which is fully sealed from the environment, a requirement here in Finland, and then we add that to the regular compost for another 2 years after that, before it eventually goes back to the soil. And I think it goes without saying, if you're taking antibiotics or other prescription medicines, you of course shouldn't add that to compost. All it really takes is a bit of common sense. But if you do want to dig deeper, then there is a wonderful book called the Humanure Handbook, which goes into all the detail and science behind composting human waste. No affiliation on my part, it's just a really delicious read, which I would thoroughly recommend. Don't need one of these. Here in Finland, the use of composting toilets, particularly in summer cottages, which are ubiquitous, is absolutely normal. Every property around here has a little red hut made of boards with a heart carved into the door. For ventilation, apparently, though why a heart shape, I'd love to know. Maybe it's just so everyone can recognise that that's a toilet. This is the original one for my property, and this is probably the last time it will feature in these videos because, for very obvious reasons, I'm about to pull it down and build a new one. Finns in general aren't afraid to use these things either. Well, perhaps not in this condition, but the ones that are maintained, and that, I think, is just the way it should be. I remember going on holidays as a child to a farm in the Yorkshire Dales which had no flushing toilets. Instead, we used a privy at the bottom of the garden, full of daddy longlegs and other creepy crawlies, which I found fascinating, but my parents definitely did not approve of. Even back then, in the 80s and early 90s, privies or outhouses seemed to be dying out in the UK, and I suspect there are very few left in 2024. I think they were associated with poverty and inconvenience. Here in Finland, they seem to be associated with environmental protection and self-sufficiency, and by all generations of people, young and old, at least in this area, which is something I personally adore. I only hope they come back into fashion everywhere in the world, because using clean water to process human waste, which is full of the very nutrients our soil needs, and then buying fertilizers derived from oil to put those same nutrients back into our gardens and farms, is an utterly unsustainable practice, both in terms of resources and cost. Finally, does it smell? Well, I know most YouTubers like to pretend that their composting toilets don't smell, but there'll be no pretending here. This channel is called Mossy Bottom after all. Yes, it smells, but mostly of homemade birch chips and lavender, because that's actually the majority of what goes in there. This is my vegetable area. I briefly showed it in the last video back in May, but as you can see, 2 months later it looks very different. My goal this year was to try and create the infrastructure needed to grow vegetables, so I built a propagator, a potting on greenhouse, and I erected a 2-meter fence with a lot of help from my partner Angela around this area, which has been cultivated and repeatedly hoed by hand this year. Though admittedly it's still full of weeds and a lot of vegetables, it has to be said. In terms of those veggies, I bought a variety of cultivars and decided that any crop I might attain on top of setting everything up was just a bonus and not something to take for granted. But it looks like the potato harvest will be good. We've already had dozens of courgettes, in fact more than dozens. Salad greens are plenty, and the pumpkins and tomatoes are growing well too. We might get a bit of sweet corn as well. And some cauliflower maybe, though it was hit hard by flea beetle, which I wasn't expecting. There are sunflowers behind me, there are peppers in front of me, and various herbs growing here too. All in all, I am delighted with the result, especially considering I was at least a month behind in sowing seeds and then planting out. And of course, this is where the resulting compost from all those wood chips, vegetable peelings, and toilet waste will end up. Growth becomes waste, becomes growth again, a circular, self-contained system. And not only will that compost enrich the soil and provide an excellent growing medium for new seedlings, but it will also act as a mulch, suppressing weed growth, and meaning I don't have to dig this area quite so much. Time now to harvest my first pumpkin of the year. Oh, I should have brought a knife, that was quite tough. Okay folks, that's just about it for this video. Time to test out my newly built dock and go on a fishing trip here in the archipelago. I've been looking forward to that. First though, I'm going to make some pumpkin soup. Or rather Angela is, and I'm going to enjoy eating it. I hope this video has inspired a few of you to create a circular compost system of your own, or just validated the system that you already have. I know many of you compost already, and rightly so. Thank you for watching. As always, subscribing and continuing to support my channel in the many ways that you do. My partner Angela posts a monthly blog on our Patreon channel, link down in the description, which has posts dating back to December 2023, covering everything from cultural differences here in Finland to raising our daughter without family nearby, to her take on growing food for self-sufficiency, and much, much more. For now though, from me and my little family, take care, keep that compost pile growing, and bye for now. Yum yum. Folks worked good and hard for the ones they loved and got above. Each day they punched their card, and when evening came back home again, they'd rest a while and say, "'Tis a hard old
life, but for kids and wife we'll work as another day. When the sun rose low, back to work they go, singing on their way. Oh, for job and home to call our own, we'll work as another day. Oh, in a Quaker town till 18 years had passed. Then I packed my bags and I said farewell for a better life at last. And for 5 years more I studied hard, and the state paid harder still. For that better life I earned my debt on her education bill. Till I threw my cap and they all did clap and shake my hand and say, well done, my son, now work's begun, you'll pay that debt one day. Oh,